The garage smelled of oil and rust, a heavy tang that clung to the air like a stubborn fog. Ellie Harper wiped her hands on her coveralls, the coarse fabric already streaked with grease from a long morning under the hood of a battered Chevy. The shop was a cavern of clanging tools and muttered curses, with cars lined up like wounded soldiers waiting for her attention. At 24, Ellie was the only woman in the crew, and the guys never let her forget it. They lounged by the coffee machine, tossing smirks her way as she wrestled with a stubborn alternator. "Hey, Ellie," called Mitch, a burly guy with a beard like steel wool, "you sure you don't need a man to tighten that for ya?" The others chuckled, their laughter bouncing off the concrete walls. Ellie didn't look up. She'd heard it all before, every jab, every snide remark about her being too delicate for the job. Her wrench bit into the bolt, and she gave it a sharp twist, her arms straining but steady. She'd been fixing cars since she was 12. Learning from her dad in their backyard shed. He'd taught her how to listen to an engine, how to feel its pulse and diagnose its ailments. "Engines don't care if you're a man or a woman," he'd said, handing her a socket wrench. "They just want someone who knows what they're doing." Ellie lived by those words, even if the guys in the shop didn't. The Chevy's alternator finally gave way, and she set it aside, wiping sweat from her brow. The shop's owner, Gus, a grizzled man with a limp from an old racing accident, shuffled over. "Ellie, got a special case coming in," he said, his voice low. "Some hotshots vintage Mustang. Says it's been to 3 shops, and nobody can get it running right. You're up." Ellie nodded, ignoring the knot in her stomach. A vintage Mustang was no small deal. Those engines were finicky, temperamental beasts. If 3 other shops had failed, the job was a minefield. She could already hear the guys snickering, waiting for her to crash and burn. The Mustang rolled in an hour later, a 1967 fastback, its red paint faded but proud, like an aging movie star. The owner, a slick guy in sunglasses named Derek, stepped out, his designer jacket out of place in the gritty shop. He barely glanced at Ellie as he handed Gus the keys. "This car's a legend," Derek said, his voice dripping with self-importance. "But it's got a gremlin. Stalls out, sputters, won't hold a tune. I've had so-called experts look at it, and they're all clueless. Hope you've got someone who knows their stuff." Gus pointed to Ellie. "She's your gal." Derek's eyebrows shot up, and he let out a short laugh. "Huh? No offense, sweetheart, but this is a man's job. This car's worth more than your house." Ellie's jaw tightened, but she kept her face neutral. "I'll take a look," she said, her voice calm but firm. Derek snorted, shaking his head, and the other mechanics exchanged glances, their grins sharp as knives. Ellie ignored them and popped the hood. The engine was a work of art, a 302 V8, all gleaming chrome and coiled potentioler, but it was a mess of mismatched parts and shoddy repairs. Whoever had worked on it last had left a trail of lazy fixes, loose wires, a misaligned distributor, and a carburetor that looked like it had been reassembled by a toddler. She ran her fingers along the fuel line, already forming a mental checklist. The guys were watching, their whispers a low hum in the background. $10 says she gives up by lunch," Mitch muttered. Ellie tuned them out. She started with the basics, checking the spark plugs and fuel pump. The plugs were fouled, caked with carbon, and the pump was wheezing like it was on its last legs. She replaced them with parts from the shop's stock, her hands moving with the precision of a surgeon. Hours passed, and she lost herself in the work, crawling under the car to inspect the exhaust and fuel lines, then climbing back to adjust the timing. The engine turned over once, twice, but it coughed and died, a guttural protest that made Derek, who'd been hovering nearby, scoff loudly. "Told you," he said to Gus. "She's in over her head." Ellie didn't flinch. She noticed a faint hiss from the intake manifold, or a vacuum leak, subtle but enough to throw the whole system off. She tightened the bolts and checked the gasket, her fingers steady despite the growing ache in her shoulders. The guys had gone quiet now, their smirks fading as they watched her work. She wasn't just tinkering, she was methodical, peeling back the engine's layers like a detective unraveling a case. By late afternoon, she'd rebuilt the carburetor, adjusted the ignition timing, and replaced a clogged fuel filter. The Mustang was starting to come alive, but it still wasn't right. The engine stuttered, refusing to settle into a smooth idle. Ellie stepped back, hands on her hips, staring at the beast under the hood. Something was off, something deeper. She closed her eyes, picturing the fuel and air mixing, the spark igniting, the pistons firing. Her dad's voice echoed in her mind, "Listen to the engine, Ellie. It'll tell you what's wrong if you pay attention." She leaned in, ear close to the engine, and cranked it again. There a faint knock, almost imperceptible, buried under the rumble. She traced it to the valve train, popping the valve cover to find a loose rocker arm. A quick adjustment, and the knock vanished. She wiped her hands and turned to Gus. "Let's fire it up." Gus nodded, and the shop fell silent as Ellie turned the key. The Mustang growled, a low, throaty rumble that filled the garage like a lion waking up. She revved it gently, and the engine responded, smooth and powerful. No hesitation, no sputter. The guys stared, mouths half open, as the sound reverberated off the walls. Derek's sunglasses slipped down his nose, his smug grin gone. Ellie stepped back, her coveralls smudged but her eyes bright. "Fixed," she said simply. Derek stammered, "Well, a broken bar, I mean, it sounds okay. Buter, take it for a spin." Ellie cut in. "You'll feel the difference." He climbed in, still skeptical, and peeled out of the garage. When he returned 10 minutes later, his face was pale, like he'd seen a ghost. "It's never run like that," he said, almost to himself. "Not even when I bought it." Ellie shrugged. "Just needed someone who listens to engines." Gus clapped her on the shoulder, a rare smile cracking his weathered face. The other mechanics were quiet, their early taunts swallowed by the Mustang's roar. Mitch muttered something about luck, but no one laughed this time. Ellie didn't need their approval. The engine's song was enough. That night, as she locked up her toolbox, Gus handed her the shop's schedule. "Your lead on the next big job," he said. "No arguments." Ellie nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. She'd earned her place, one bolt at a time. The next morning, Ellie arrived at the garage before dawn, her breath visible in the chilly air. The Mustang job had shifted something in the shop. The guys weren't exactly warm, but the jabs had stopped, replaced by a grudging silence. Mitch avoided her eyes, focusing on his own work for once. Ellie didn't care. She had a new project, a 1970 Dodge Charger, brought in by a quiet older man named Mr. Callahan. He'd heard about her from Derek, who'd been singing her praises on some car forum online. "They say you're the one to fix my girl," Callahan said, patting the Charger's faded black hood. "She's been sitting in my barn for 20 years. I want her to sing again." Ellie nodded, already itching to dive in. The Charger was a beast, its Hemi engine a legend, but neglect had taken its toll. Rust speckled the body, and the engine was a tangle of seized parts and brittle hoses. She spent the day tearing it down, her hands moving with the same relentless focus as before. The guys watched from a distance, occasionally muttering, but none dared challenge her now. By noon, she diagnosed a dozen issues: a cracked distributor cap, a gummed-up carburetor, and a timing chain that was stretched to breaking. She worked late, long after the others had left, the shop lit only by a single overhead bulb. Callahan stopped by the next day, his eyes lighting up as he saw the progress. "You're bringing her back," he said, voice thick with emotion. Ellie just nodded, her hands deep in the engine bay. Over the next week, she rebuilt the Charger piece by piece, sourcing rare parts and machining what she couldn't find. When she finally fired it up, the Hemi's roar shook the garage, a deep, primal sound that made even Gus pause. Callahan wept when he heard it, hugging Ellie like she was family. Word spread. Soon, the shop was getting calls from collectors, racers, and gearheads, all asking for the woman who fixed the Mustang. Ellie worked harder than ever, her reputation growing with every engine she revived. The guys stopped laughing. Some even started asking her advice, their pride swallowed by her results. One evening, as she cleaned her tools, Mitch approached, scratching his beard. "You're all right, Harper," he muttered, then walked away. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Ellie locked up the garage quiet except for the faint hum of a cooling engine. She'd proven them wrong, not with words, but with the roar of machines brought back to life. Ellie Harper's boots crunched on the gravel outside the garage, the early morning air sharp with the bite of autumn. The shop was still dark, its metal shutters rattling faintly in the wind. She unlocked the side door, flicking on the overhead lights that buzzed to life, casting a harsh glow over the rows of cars waiting for her hands. The memory of the Mustang's roar from the day before lingered in her mind, a triumphant hum that drowned out the echoes of the guys' laughter. She'd shown Thema Derek, Mitch, all of Thema that she wasn't just some token hire, some girl playing at a man's job. But one win wasn't enough. Not in this shop, where every day felt like a gauntlet. She set her toolbox down with a heavy clunk, the tools inside clinking like a warrior's armor. Today's challenge was already waiting. The 1970 Dodge Charger, Mr. Callahan's pride and joy, a beast that had been rotting in a barn for 2 decades. She ran her hand along its faded black hood, feeling the pitted metal under her fingers. It was more than a car, it was a promise. A chance to cement her place in a world that kept trying to push her out. The garage filled with the usual morning chaos as the other mechanics trickled in. Mitch, still stinging from yesterday's humbling, kept his distance, burying himself in a routine oil change. The others are Tommy, a wiry kid with a quick laugh, and Ray, a grizzled veteran who rarely spoke. He cast sidelong glances her way, their silence louder than their old taunts. Gus, the shop's owner, limped over, his eyes scanning the Charger. "Callahan's counting on you," he said, his voice gruff but warm. "Words getting around about that Mustang. Don't let this one bite you." Ellie nodded, already pulling on her gloves. She didn't need the warning. A car like this, a Hemi-powered monster, was a different beast from the Mustang. It demanded respect, and she was ready to give it. She popped the hood, revealing an engine bay that looked like it had been through a war. Rust flaked off the valve covers, and the carburetor was a mess of gummed-up jets and warped gaskets. The wiring was a rat's nest, brittle and frayed, and the fuel lines were so clogged she could barely blow air through them. Ellie took a deep breath, the familiar scent of oil and decay grounding her. This wasn't just a job, it was a puzzle, a challenge that spoke to her in a language she'd known since she was a kid, tinkering in her dad's shed. Back then, it was just the two of them, a radio playing old rock tunes while he guided her hands over a carburetor or a timing belt. "Feel the machine, Ellie," he'd say. "It's got a heartbeat." Find it. She'd been finding heartbeats ever since. She started with the faulty Erdone, her hands moving with quiet precision. The other mechanics worked around her, their chatter fading as she pulled the carburetor apart, cleaning each jet with a wire brush until they gleamed. Tommy wandered over, pretending to check a nearby toolbox, but she caught him watching. "That thing's a lost cause," he said, half joking. "You're wasting your time." Ellie didn't look up. "Engines don't die," she said. "They just need someone to listen." Tommy snorted but didn't walk away, his curiosity betraying him. She ignored him, focusing on the distributor next. The cap was cracked, the rotor worn to a nub. She replaced them, her fingers deft despite the cold creeping into the garage. Hours passed, the shop's rhythm settling around here, a clanging wrenches, the hiss of an air compressor, the occasional curse from Ray as he wrestled with a stubborn bolt. Ellie barely noticed. The Charger was her world now, its engine a map she was learning inch by inch. By midday, she'd identified a dozen problems: a stretched timing chain, a seized fuel pump, and a set of spark plugs so fouled they looked like they'd been dipped in tar. She made a list, cross-referencing parts with the shop's inventory. Some were easy to source, ear filters, hoses, but others, like the Hemi's Pacific valve springs, were rare. She called around, tracking down a supplier 2 states over who had what she needed. Gus overheard her haggling on the phone, his eyebrows lifting slightly. "You're spending my money like it's yours," he said, but there was no bite in his voice. Ellie just shrugged. "You want it done right, don't you?" He grunted, a faint smile tugging at his lips, and walked away. The parts arrived the next day, and Ellie dove back in. She worked late, long after the others had clocked out, the garage lit only by a single overhead bulb that swayed in the draft. The Charger's engine was starting to take shape, its components cleaned and rebuilt, but it was still silent, a sleeping giant. She crawled under the car, checking the exhaust system for leaks, her flashlight cutting through the shadows. The mufflers were rusted through, and the pipes were barely holding together. She added them to her list, her mind already calculating the hours it would take to replace them. As she slid out from under the car, she caught a glimpse of herself in a nearby window, a grease-streaked face, hair pulled back under a bandana, coveralls worn thin at the knees. She looked like her dad, back when he was still strong, before the cancer took him. The thought tightened her chest, but she pushed it down. No time for that now. The next morning, Mr. Callahan stopped by, his weathered hands clutching a thermos of coffee. He was a quiet man, his eyes carrying the weight of years, but they lit up when he saw the Charger. "She's looking better already," he said, his voice soft. "Used to take my wife out in this car, back when we were young, drove it to our wedding." Ellie paused, her wrench still in hand. "She'll run again," she said. "I promise." Callahan nodded, his gaze lingering on the car like it was a piece of his past he could still touch. He left without another word, and Ellie felt the weight of his trust settle on her shoulders. She couldn't let him down. Days blurred together, each one a marathon of wrenching, welding, and cursing under her breath. The guys in the shop had stopped commenting, their silence a grudging acknowledgement of her skill. Even Mitch, who'd been the loudest doubter, kept his distance, though she caught him glancing over when she fired up the compressor or torqued a bolt with a particularly satisfying clank. She rebuilt the carburetor from scratch, machined a new gasket for the intake manifold, and replaced the timing chain with surgical precision. The Hemi was starting to look like an engine again, but it still wouldn't sing. She cranked it once, twice, and got nothing but a weak sputter, the sound of a machine refusing to wake. The guys exchanged looks, their old skepticism creeping back. Ellie ignored them, closing her eyes to listen. There it was, a faint hiss, barely audible, coming from the fuel line. She traced it to a pinhole leak, so small it was almost invisible. A quick batch, and she tried again. The engine coughed, then caught, a low rumble that shook the garage floor. But it wasn't too rough, too uneven. She killed the ignition, her mind racing. She spent the next day chasing the problem, checking every system twice. The fuel mixture was off, the timing slightly out of sync. She adjusted the carburetor jets, tweaked the distributor, and double-checked the valve clearances. Her hands were raw, her back aching, but she didn't stop. The shop was empty now, the others gone home, and the silence let her hear the engine's voice more clearly. She cranked it again, and this time, the rumble was deeper, steadier. She revved it gently, feeling the vibrations through the floor. The Hemi was waking up, but it still wasn't singing. She leaned in, ear close to the engine bay, and caught a faint knock, like a heartbeat skipping. The lifters, one of them was sticking, throwing off the whole rhythm. She pulled the valve cover, her hands steady despite the late hour, and found the culprit, a worn lifter, barely moving. She replaced it with one from the shop's dwindling stock, her fingers trembling from fatigue but precise as ever. The next morning, she was back before the others, her eyes gritty but focused. She buttoned up the engine, checked every connection, and took a deep breath. This was it. She turned the key, and the Charger roared to life, a deep, primal bellow that rattled the tools on the workbench. The sound filled the garage, rich and powerful, like a thunderstorm trapped in metal. Ellie stepped back, her heart pounding, a grin spreading across her face. The guys arrived just as she revved it again, the Hemi's song drowning out their footsteps. Tommy's jaw dropped, and Ray, who never showed emotion, gave a slow nod. Mitch stood frozen, his wrench dangling in his hand. Gus walked in, his limp more pronounced in the cold, and stopped dead. "Well, damn," he said, his voice barely audible over the engine. "You did it." Callahan came by that afternoon, his eyes wide as he heard the Charger's roar. He climbed into the driver's seat, his hands shaking as he gripped the wheel. Ellie stood by, watching as he took it for a test drive, the car tearing down the street with a sound that turned heads. When he returned, His face was wet with tears. "It's like 1970 again," he said, his voice breaking. "Thank you." Ellie just nodded, her throat tight. She didn't need his thanks, so the engine's roar was enough. Word of the Charger spread fast. Car forums lit up with posts about the girl at Gus's shop, and soon, the garage was getting calls from across the state. Collectors wanted her for their vintage rides, racers for their tuned-up beasts. Gus started giving her the lead on every big job. His trust in her absolute. The guys in the shop stopped whispering. Some, like Tommy, started asking her questions, their pride giving way to curiosity. Even Mitch, after a week of sulking, approached her one evening as she cleaned her tools. "You're good, Harper," he said, his voice low. "Didn't think you had it in you." Ellie looked up, meeting his eyes. "Engines don't care what you think," she said. "They just need someone who gets them." Mitch nodded, a ghost of a smile breaking through, and walked away. Ellie locked up that night, the garage quiet except for the faint hum of the Charger's cooling engine. She'd proven herself, not just to the guys, but to herself. Every bolt she tightened, every wire she'd spliced, was a step toward something bigger, a legacy her dad would have been proud of. She stepped outside, the stars bright above the shop, and took a deep breath. The road ahead was long, but she was ready. The engines were calling, and she knew how to make them sing. The next week brought a new challenge, a 1969 Camaro SS. Its owner, a skeptical racer who'd heard the rumors about Ellie but wasn't convinced. "I need this thing track ready," he said, eyeing her coveralls like they were a costume. "No offense, but I'm not sure you're up for it." Ellie just smiled, her wrench already in hand. "Let's see what she's got," she said, popping the hood. The Camaro's engine was a beast, a 396 big block that had been abused on the circuit. She dove in, her hands moving with the same relentless focus, the same love for the machine. The shop watched, quieter now, as she worked her magic. And when the Camaro finally roared, its exhaust popping like gunfire, the racer's skepticism melted into awe. Ellie Harper wasn't just a mechanic, she was the one who made engines sing, and no one could laugh at that. The garage was busier than ever, its bays filled with cars that had come from as far as the next state over, all because of Ellie Harper. The 1969 Camaro SS she'd just finished roared out of the shop, its owner, a racer named Vince, grinning like a kid on Christmas. He'd been doubtful at first, his eyes narrowing when he saw her, a woman in grease-stained coveralls, but the Camaro's track-ready growl had silenced him. Now, he was shaking her hand, promising to spread the word. Ellie nodded, wiping her hands on a rag, but her mind was already on the next job. The shop's phone hadn't stopped ringing since the Charger's revival, and Gus was struggling to keep up with the bookings. "You're putting us on the map, kid," he'd said, half grumbling, half proud. Ellie didn't let it go to her head. Fame didn't fix cars, focus did. That afternoon, a new client rolled in, a sleek 1965 Pontiac GTO towed on a flatbed. Its owner, a woman named Carla, stepped out, her sharp suit and heels clashing with the garage's gritty air. She was a collector, her voice clipped and confident, but her eyes held a flicker of doubt as she scanned the shop. "I heard about you," Carla said, addressing Ellie directly. "They say you're the best with classics. My GTO's been to 4 shops, and none of them could get it right. It's a tri-power rare, finicky. You up for it?" Ellie met her gaze, feeling the weight of the challenge. A tri-power GTO was no joke, 3 carburetors working in sync, a setup notorious for its complexity. "I'll get it running," she said simply. Carla raised an eyebrow but handed over the keys. "I hope so," she said. "I'm tired of mechanics who think they know better than me." Ellie popped the hood, revealing an engine bay that was both a masterpiece and a mess. The 389 V8 was intact, but the carburetors were out of balance, the linkage misaligned, and the fuel lines were a patchwork of bad repairs. She ran her fingers along the throttle valves, already hearing the engine's complaints in her mind. The guys in the shop, Mitch, Tommy, Ray, watched from their stations, their earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet curiosity. They'd seen her tame the Mustang, the Charger, and now the Camaro. But to try power, even Ray, who'd been wrenching for 30 years, muttered, "That's a beast." "Good luck, kid." Ellie ignored him, her focus narrowing to the machine in front of her. She started with the carburetors, dismantling each one with care. The jets were clogged, the floats sticking, and the gaskets brittle as old paper. She cleaned and rebuilt them, her hands steady despite the intricate work. Hours passed, the shop's noise fading into a hum as she adjusted the linkage, ensuring the three carbs would open in perfect harmony. By evening, she'd replaced the fuel pump and rerouted the lines, her knuckles scraped but her mind clear. She cranked the engine, and it sputtered, a weak cough that made Tommy smirk from across the garage. Ellie didn't flinch. She tweaked the idle screws, listening to the engine's rhythm, and tried again. This time, it caught, a rough growl that smoothed out as she feathered the throttle. Not perfect, but close. The next day, she dove deeper, chasing a misfire that haunted the high RPMs. She checked the ignition system, finding a worn coil and a distributor that was a hair off. She replaced them, her hands moving with the precision of a watchmaker. Carla stopped by, her arms crossed as she watched Ellie work. "You're thorough," she said, her tone neutral. "But thorough doesn't mean fixed." Ellie nodded, unfazed. "It will be." She spent the afternoon balancing the carburetors, using a vacuum gauge to dial in the mixture. The GTO was starting to sing, its exhaust note deepening, but it still wasn't the raw Carla wanted. Ellie closed her eyes, picturing the air and fuel dancing through the engine, and caught a faint stumble in the idle. She traced it to the timing chain, slightly stretched, throwing off the valve timing. A new chain, a few hours of work, and the engine was ready. The following morning, with the shop buzzing around her, Ellie fired up the GTO. The tri-power awed, a rich, layered sound that filled the garage like a symphony. The guys stopped, tools in hand, as the engine revved, clean and powerful, no hesitation, no misfire. Carla, who'd just walked in, froze, her cool facade cracking into a smile. "That's my car," she said, almost to herself. She climbed in, took it for a drive, and returned with a grin that mirrored Vince's. "You're the real deal," she said, handing Ellie her card. "I've got more cars. You're my mechanic now." Ellie pocketed the card, her face calm but her heart racing. Another engine, another victory. That night, as she locked up, Gus approached, his limp heavy in the quiet shop. "You're changing things, Ellie," he said. "Not just cars, people." "Keep it up." She nodded, the weight of his words settling in. The laughter was gone, replaced by respect, hard-earned and undeniable. Outside, under the stars, she thought of her dad, his voice guiding her hands. The GTO's roar echoed in her mind, a promise kept, a legacy growing. More engines waited, and she'd make them all sing. Handed over the keys. "I hope so," she said. "I'm tired of mechanics who think they know better than me." Ellie popped the hood, revealing an engine bay that was both a masterpiece and a mess. The 389 V8 was intact, but the carburetors were out of balance, the linkage misaligned, and the fuel lines were a patchwork of bad repairs. She ran her fingers along the throttle valves, already hearing the engine's complaints in her mind. The guys in the shop, Mitch, Tommy, Ray, watched from their stations, their earlier skepticism replaced by a quiet curiosity. They'd seen her tame the Mustang, the Charger, and now the Camaro. But to try power, even Ray, who'd been wrenching for 30 years, muttered, "That's a beast." "Good luck, kid." Ellie ignored him, her focus narrowing to the machine in front of her. She started with the carburetors, dismantling each one with care. The jets were clogged, the floats sticking, and the gaskets brittle as old paper. She cleaned and rebuilt them, her hands steady despite the intricate work. Hours passed, the shop's noise fading into a hum as she adjusted the linkage, ensuring the three carbs would open in perfect harmony. By evening, she'd replaced the fuel pump and rerouted the lines, her knuckles scraped but her mind clear. She cranked the engine, and it sputtered, a weak cough that made Tommy smirk from across the garage. Ellie didn't flinch. She tweaked the idle screws, listening to the engine's rhythm, and tried again. This time, It caught a rough growl that smoothed out as she feathered the throttle. Not perfect, but close. The next day, she dove deep